We are this morning in the book of 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 4. It is required is the title of our message this morning. And our text is the first 5 verses of chapter 4. And then we're going to come back and really concentrate on verse 2. It says, "Let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Christ, and stewards of the mysteries of God." We remember last week as we were talking about Peter, and Peter talked to you and to me about the manifold grace of God. And now Peter backing that up, but this time he is saying that we are stewards of the mysteries. The world doesn't understand what God is doing. The world looks around and it sees how life is going, and to them it just looks chaotic. To you and to me, we know that all things are in God's hand, and that He is working all things out to His honor and glory. And so you and I are the stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. But with me, it is a small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgments. Yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing by myself, yet am I not hereby justified, but he that judgeth me is the Lord. Therefore, judge nothing before the time, until the Lord cometh, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the heart. And then every man will have praise of God. Go back to verse 2, though, very quickly. It is required of the steward that a man be found faithful. One of the great emphasis that Paul brings out in his writings as he writes to Christian people is the idea that God is faithful. You can trust God to be faithful. You can trust God to be dependable. He declares that God can be depended on when you and I are facing trials and tribulations. We can depend on God to bear our burden. We can be encouraged and motivated to serve the Lord. Why? Because we know that our labor is not in vain when we labor for the Lord, because God will reward those who serve Him. He emphasizes to you and I the idea of the faithfulness of God. It is significant when one recognizes then as disciples, we're supposed to become like our Master. If our Master is dependable, if our Master is trustworthy, if our Master is faithful, then you and I too are required to become faithful. So we read again that it is required that a man be found faithful. Now remember what a steward is. You and I are called stewards. The New Testament preaches the idea of stewardship. You and I are stewards. A steward is somebody who manages or supervises that which is entrusted to him by another. Something that belongs to someone else. But he gives us trust. He says, this is mine, but I want you to spend it for me. This is mine, but I want you to distribute it the way I would distribute it myself. So we consider for a moment this responsibility. You know, it's not required that you and I should be brilliant or successful, which is pretty good because I'm neither of those two things. And so if God said it's required of a steward that he be brilliant, I don't know. If brilliance is a 200-watt bulb, I'm somewhere around 15. Okay? But we're not required to be brilliant. He didn't say that. He didn't say you have to be successful. If you're a successful businessman, a successful businesswoman, you can be a... He doesn't say that. He didn't say it's required that you be brilliant or that you be successful. He did, however, say that it is required that you and I be faithful. And we can accomplish that. Why? Because it's the will of God that you should be faithful. If God says, I want you to be faithful, guess what He gives you the power to become? He gives you the power to be faithful. Let's consider a few things in that our stewardship, our faithfulness to God will include. A steward must be faithful to God then in the use of his time. Time, you know, is one of those precious gifts. You say, oh, I don't know that. Hey, wait till the last hour of your life. When the clock is ticking and the doctor says to you, you have only days or hours, all of a sudden time will become precious and you'll want more of it and you'll give anything you've got to get a little bit more time. Time is precious. It is a gift that God places at our disposal. So far, He's allowed me to burn up 57 of those years. I've had a lot of time. Time to work. Oh, I've gone out and I've worked for the Lord. God plans that His people in the Old Testament, you had to work 6 days. Because we're good old Americans, we only have to worry about 5. But under God's economy, you work for 6. There was time for working. You look at the world in which we live and all the things that have been built, that have been created, that have been made by men who have worked. There is time for work. And so you and I must examine how we spend our time. Do we spend our time working? But not only that, but also resting. The Lord who made the Sabbath day reminded men, hey, listen, I worked 6 days myself, and then I took a break on the 7th day, God said. And since you're supposed to be like me, I want you to work 6 days, but I want you to take the 7th day off. So here we are. But again, being Americans, the Sabbath day is Saturday. So the Jews took Saturday off, kind of left us Gentiles out of it, and we needed a day too, so we took Sunday. So good old America, we take the whole weekend off. We're a spoiled bunch of people. I like it. I would say I like it. And so there is this opportunity to rest. We work for 6. You say, but preacher, don't you work? I do, but I take Monday off. I get my rest in there. God said I have to, so hey, I'm not going to argue with you. I take a day off like everybody else does. But we also have time to serve. Serve one another. How do I serve God? You know, it's kind of hard. Because there's nothing I can really do for God in a very strict sense. I can't polish His shoes. I can't go get His clothes. I can't make Him dinner. I can't do any of those things. But He says, when you do it for the least of my children, then you've done it for me. When you remember the widows and when you remember the orphans, you're remembering me. When you're remembering the poor, you're remembering me. When you serve one another, then you're serving me. Wednesday night, we gathered together in prayer because Brother Richie was somewhat concerned. And rightfully so. You know, he said this morning he got 50% custody. We were excited about that. But his real fear was losing all of it. And so not only did God make sure that he got to keep, but gave him more than he was having. He was only allowed to see his own son on the weekend. Now he gets him half the time. Amen. So he's excited about that. We're hoping as time goes by, he'll get 75%, maybe 100%. We're not greedy, we'll take 99.9. But serving. You served the Lord when you gathered here last Wednesday night and prayed. And delivered this joyous occasion to this couple who were so excited that even Mama had to come up and sing. She was excited about that. So our time. But a steward must not only be faithful in our time, a steward must also be faithful in their talents. We talked about this. You cannot say, if God says, I require time, then He had to give you some time. Some of you in here have had more time than I've got. Some of us have less time left than others in here. But God has given every one of us time. There's no argument of that. None of us in this room can say, God never gave me any time. Oh, He did. He gave you time. And He also said He gave you a talent. He gave you a gift. He gave you something that you can do and be to the church. And you say, I haven't. You call God a liar. God gave you a talent. He said so. He said He made you steward of the mysteries of God. Peter last week said that God made you steward of the manifold grace, the many graces, the multi-colors of God's grace. He bestowed on each and every one of us one of those gifts. Now, He didn't make us all the preacher. You don't have to worry about coming up here and coming up with a sermon and preaching. That's not maybe your gift. My son Michael, he's got to worry. He's got to come up here Sunday night and preach. You don't have to. He didn't give you that calling. He didn't give you that gift. But He gave you a gift. And therefore, you are required then to use that gift for God's glory. We can be a joy to others if we would properly use our gift. Talents are not something that we exploit for ourselves. There are people, for example, that God gave them the ability to sing. And oh, they sing beautifully and they make millions of dollars. But what glory, what credit does God get for that? Stop and think when the angels stand and hear these people sing, and yet they would rather sing about the bar and the honky-tonk than sing about Jesus Christ. When they stand before God and they see how wonderful He is, and they say to themselves, I never sang of His glory. What a responsibility they have. The ability to teach maybe our children. Martha's Vineyard and Mary's Little Lambs out there using, let me tell you, oh, what a gift it was. There was Mary, and for the most part, we never thought of her as a Sunday school teacher. But wow, when she got in there, man, she just took off. The creativity, the artistry, the things that she does in that classroom, just tremendous. Martha, they're teaching your children, even while you sit in here. And so we must use our talents. Every talent carries a responsibility. And if there's a responsibility, then there must be some sort of an accounting. There must be a day in which God says to you, your talent is required. What did you do with that which I gave to you? God doesn't expect us to excel in the sense maybe that we win every race. But if we would please Him, we must be reliable and dependable in the use of our talent that He gave to us. You need to know that God gave you a talent. And if you're not using it, God will require that at your hand. There's probably something, you know, first place, look, what hobbies do you enjoy? What things do you enjoy doing? Is there a way to utilize that around the church? We got folks who enjoy gardening. You don't suppose your church could use a couple of gardeners around here? There are men who enjoy, and women who enjoy painting. You don't suppose this whole place could use a little bit of that? Maybe God made you an electrician or a plumber. Let me tell you, you don't think we could use a carpenter or two? Or a plumber? You think this building just stands up all by itself? Maybe you just get excited by cleaning. Hey, come on down and have a ball. But whatever your talent is, Maybe you like people and you should be out inviting people to church. Mike would be more than happy to give you all the tools you need. Give you a place, assign you a spot on the map where that's yours. When I was in real estate, we used to have what we called our farms. It was a tract of area that we would go in there and hand out. Every 3 weeks we'd go out and hand out some sort of information, something that people knew we were in the area, and if they wanted to buy or sell a house, we'd be the person they'd call. And maybe you need to develop your own farm and go out there and place out tracts every now and then with your name on it, so when people think about Jesus, when they have a problem or trouble, they'll be thinking about you. Wow. Can you imagine somebody listen, they might not, sometimes you go out there for years and years and years and nobody wants to buy or sell, and all of a sudden something happens and they've got to move to Florida. And they said, oh, I need somebody to sell. Oh, wait, that guy used to come by all the time. Call him. My family was visited one time, mind you, my wife's church, where her father was the pastor. They had their own church they would go to, and this church used to pick them up. Well, this church, all of a sudden, my sister's car broke down. They couldn't get to church. And they said, wait, how are we going to get to church? They said, you know, there used to be another church that came by all the time and said that they had buses and they'd pick us up. Saddest day, my wife's church picked up my family. 8 people come out of that house, got on that bus. And that's how I met my wife. Through my family going to that church. Why? Because they said, wait, they dug in the kitchen drawer. You know, you got that kitchen drawer that's got everything that you ever lost or found, right? And they went in there, they found that little piece of paper that said, this church picks you up on the bus. They called that church, the bus came by. Ever since. Amen. Maybe that's the talent you have. But there's also a steward must be found faithful, not only in our time, not only in our talent, but also in our treasures. God, we're told in Deuteronomy, gives the power to get wealth. You ever realize that? You say, I don't have any. God has the power. God said He can give you the power to get wealth. You might want to write down Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18. If you ain't got the power right now, you might want to find out where it lies. But, again, it's tied to stewardship. What if God gave you money and you were too greedy to share it with Him? Think He's going to give you any more? God expects us to earn our money by honest means. Helpful means. Not only do I pastor here, but I'm also an engineer in a hospital. I serve a meaningful role. They lost power down there even this morning. First person they called, my phone's ringing. Hey, we just had a power outage. Did the generators kick in? Oh yeah. 3 seconds later. Hey, I made sure that those generators kick in within 3 seconds when the power loses it. Everybody was glad I was around. I said, if they give you any trouble, you give me a call back. I'll come on by. So, God expects that we should earn our money by honest means. God requires that we share our income with the work of the kingdom. In the Old Testament, the law required Israelites to bring a tithe into the storehouse. In the New Testament, love requires that we put our total selves at God's disposal. Our time, our talent, our treasures. But also a steward must be faithful in the handling of trouble. What? Yeah, you know, if you're a good steward, you even handle your trouble properly. That's what, see, not all trouble, not all of our trials come from God. Sometimes we bring it on ourselves. Sometimes we do that stupid little thing we knew we shouldn't have done, but we did it anyway. We just couldn't help it. And the next thing you know, we're having problems. And what do we normally do? What's the normal human reaction to problems? Well, we get bitter, we get hostile, we get rebellious against God. God, why did you do this? God said, I had nothing to do with it. That was your own stupid fault this time. Let me tell you, oh yeah, 2 weeks ago I brought one to you and I took you through it. This one you did all by yourself. Don't you blame me for this. But we like to blame God. If God says don't do it, and we do it anyway,
we're still going to blame him because we're in trouble. That's just how we are. But God knows better. And he'll say, don't worry, I'll help you through it anyway. See, but we have to be proper stewards even with our troubles. We can't become discouraged, depressed, and defeated by them. We have to rather repent of the thing that placed us in that position. But we must be good stewards. We must remember to be faithful to our Lord, especially when trouble comes. Hard to do, but if I'm a good steward of God, I'm faithful even in my troubles. Peter says, you know, there's always a couple of things you can always do in any situation. Trust and obey. We sing the song, trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. You can always do that in any situation. We're good stewards. But we must also be faithful stewards to God in giving our Christian testimony. There are those out there who don't know Jesus Christ and won't know Him if you don't share it. Jesus Christ commanded that you and I should share with the whole world the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I am with you unto the end of the age to help you to accomplish that, He said. To be silent in the present of great spiritual need is inhuman. It is unnatural, and it is unchristian. Many times I'll be walking the halls of the hospital and I'll see somebody outside the surgery center. Or I'll walk down a hallway and there'll be somebody crying, and the Lord will say sometimes, stop and talk to that person. Doesn't always tell me to, but every now and then He'll say, stop for just a moment. I remember there was and I shared with you, a mother, 15-year-old daughter. I went into the ICU. You expect to see folks our age there, you know, hanging on life support. Gray-haired old people. That's usually where we end up on our way out. But you don't expect to see 15-year-old girls there. People with blonde hair, laying there, look more like an angel. I thought to myself, this is not normal. 15-year-old girls don't belong in this place. I happened to see the mother out in the hallway, and I could tell she was heavily burdened. And so I stopped, you remember I told you, and talked to her. I'm not allowed to know names and numbers. It's illegal for me to know names. So I said, listen, I don't want to know anything about your daughter. I know she's here. I saw her down there. I recognize you as the mama. She said, well, her first name is... I said, but you've got to promise not to give me a last name. Okay. And I said, I'd like to pray for you. And remember, I brought it here to the church. And the next thing, when I got back, she was out of the ICU. Lord. Right? See, that's what God does. He said, hey, she was grateful. I told her I was the pastor of Mountain View Baptist Church, and we wanted to pray for her daughter. And we did. And next thing you know, daughter and mama are at home. So, why? Because we are Christians with a testimony. And we are stewards with a testimony. I told her I knew a God who knows and answers prayer, and I know people who delight to hear and pray. And so I shared those things with him. And so we must do that. So it's not required in a steward that we have natural intelligence. It's not required that I be highly educated. It's not required that I have some sort of unusual cleverness about me. I don't have to be Sherlock Holmes. I don't have to be innovative or creative. But I do have to be trustworthy. I do have to be reliable. I do have to be dependable. I do have to be faithful. It is required in a steward that a man or a woman be found faithful. So consider your stewardship. How are you doing with those things? How are you doing with your time? How much, let me ask, you know, to be quite honest, first few moments of your day, who do you give those to? See, the thing about stewardship was you always gave God the first. So when you wake up in the morning, who's the first person? Most of us are running the clock. We wake up late, we grab that extra couple of minutes of snooze, and then we're racing all day long. We have to drive like a madman down the freeway because we were late. Let me tell you, if you got up first and gave God the first few minutes of your day, probably the rest of it would go a whole lot better. And when we get paid, do we think of God first? Well, look at this, I got a paycheck. I have an opportunity, I have a chance now to help out. I can do my part because God gave me. Those are just the thoughts that Christians have about Him. It's all about Him. They gave themselves first, and then everything else follows. Paul was cautious to say, I don't want your money. I want you. Because once I have you, God will get everything you got. Because you love Him. Because you love Him. And we'll keep running unto Mountain View. We'll continue to move forward, continue to grow, continue to change lives. Because you made it possible by your stewardship. That's all.